The morning fog clung to Copperhead Ridge like smoke from a dying fire, thick enough to hide the federal vehicles winding up the mountain road until it was too late to run. October 15th, 1979 would be remembered as the day the government made its biggest mistake in these haulers since they'd tried to collect taxes during the Depression. But before we dive into how 11 revenue men vanished into the Appalachian wilderness, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Samuel Little Sam. Hatfield stood barely 4 feet 2 inches tall, but every person in Logan County, West Virginia knew better than to measure a man by his height alone. At 53 years old, Sam had carved out a reputation built on 3 generations of mountain wisdom, federal defiance, and the finest corn whiskey these hills had ever produced. His operation wasn't just a business, it was a family legacy passed down through bloodlines that predated the government's right to tax what a man made with his own hands on his own land. The Hatfield compound sat nestled in a natural bowl between 2 ridges, invisible from the main road and accessible only through a network of deer paths and logging trails that had been used by moonshiners since before the Civil War. Samuel's grandfather had chosen this spot in 1923, not just for its isolation but for its defensibility. The hollers echoed sounds for miles, and every approach could be watched from hidden positions carved into the rock faces above. Samuel's 3 sons, Marcus, age 28, Jesse, 25, and young Tom, barely 19, had learned the family trade the way other children learned to read. Each stood under 5 feet tall, inheriting their father's compact build and their mother's sharp intelligence. Their sister, Ruth Ellen, was 26 and possessed what locals called mountain sight, an ability to read weather, track movement, and sense trouble long before it arrived at your doorstep. The Hatfield operation produced roughly 200 gallons of pure corn whiskey each month, distributed through a network of trusted contacts across 3 counties. They paid no federal taxes, followed no government regulations, and had operated without interference for over 50 years. The family code was simple: mind your own business, respect the mountain, and never ever talk to federal agents. That morning, Ruth Ellen woke before dawn with what her grandmother would have called the knowing. Something in the air felt wrong, too quiet, too still, like the forest was holding its breath. She found her father checking the pressure gauges on the copper still, a routine he performed every morning with the precision of a craftsman who understood that one mistake could destroy everything. "Papa," Ruth Ellen said, her voice carrying the weight of generations of mountain intuition, "we need to shut down the run." Samuel paused, his weathered hands still gripping the valve. In 50 years of making whiskey, he'd learned to trust his daughter's instincts above all else. If Ruth Ellen said, "Shut down," you shut down. "Boys," Samuel called softly. Within minutes, Marcus, Jesse, and Tom appeared from different sections of the compound. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who'd practiced this routine hundreds of times, banking the fires, draining the pipes, securing the equipment, and preparing the site for what mountain people called a visit from unwelcome company. By 7:30 that morning, the Hatfield compound looked like nothing more than an abandoned lumber camp. The still was hidden beneath a false floor covered with rotting planks and scattered debris. The copper pipes were buried under carefully arranged firewood. Even the smell of fermentation had been masked by strategically burned pine boughs and scattered horse manure. Federal agent William Big Bill Carson had been hunting moonshiners for 12 years, and he'd never encountered a family as elusive as the Hatfields. At 6 feet 4 inches and weighing over 230 pounds, Carson cut an intimidating figure in his government-issued jacket and polished boots. He led a team of 11 revenue men, all armed, all trained, and all convinced that their federal authority meant something in these mountains. Carson's intel came from Tommy Briggs, a local man who'd been caught running whiskey across county lines, and had traded information for reduced federal charges. Briggs had provided detailed maps, described the family members, and assured Carson that the Hatfields were just a bunch of runts who'd fold the moment they saw real authority. The convoy of 4 black government vehicles climbed Copperhead Ridge at 8:15 that morning, their engines echoing through the hollers like a funeral procession. Carson sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, studying aerial photographs and criminal profiles. The file on Samuel Hatfield was surprisingly thin. No federal arrests, no violent crimes, just decades of suspected tax evasion, and a reputation for making liquor that could knock a grown man unconscious with 3 sips. What Carson's files didn't contain was any mention of the Mountain Code, the unwritten law that governed life in these hollers. The code was simple. The government had no business in family affairs, no right to tax what you made with your own hands, and no authority to arrest men for following traditions older than the Constitution itself. Break the code, and you answered to the mountain. And the mountain, as Carson was about to discover, had its own way of settling accounts. The federal vehicles reached the compound at 8:47. Carson's men deployed with textbook precision, surrounding the site, blocking escape routes, and establishing communication protocols. They found exactly what they expected to find: an abandoned lumber camp with a few old buildings and no signs of recent activity. Carson kicked through the debris, his polished boots scraping against rotting planks. "Tear it apart," he ordered. "Check every building, every board, every rock pile. They're here somewhere." For 2 hours, the revenue men systematically destroyed the compound. They pulled apart storage sheds, overturned equipment, and probed every inch of ground with metal detectors. Agent Perry Williams, Carson's second-in-command, started pulling up floorboards in the main building when his probe struck something metallic beneath the false floor. "Carson!" Williams shouted. "We got something." Within 20 minutes, they'd uncovered the complete Moonshine operation. The copper still gleamed like buried treasure, its intricate coil system representing decades of accumulated knowledge and craftsmanship. Carson whistled low, impressed despite himself by the sophistication of the setup. "This isn't some backwoods operation," Carson muttered to Williams. "This is professional-grade equipment, worth maybe $15,000–$20,000. What Carson didn't realize was that Samuel Hatfield and his family were watching every move from concealed positions carved into the ridge above the compound. Ruth Ellen lay flat against a granite outcrop, studying the federal agents through binoculars her grandfather had used to watch for revenue men during Prohibition. Marcus and Jesse were positioned at opposite ends of the ridge, each armed with hunting rifles and intimate knowledge of every trail, every boulder, and every hiding place within a 5-mile radius. Samuel himself crouched behind a fallen oak tree that had been strategically positioned to provide perfect cover while maintaining a clear view of the compound. He watched Carson's men photograph his still, bag his equipment, and load everything into their vehicles with the casual efficiency of people who believed they were simply doing their jobs. Young Tom was positioned at the base of the ridge, ready to shadow the federal convoy when it left. The plan was simple: follow at a distance, identify their route, and determine where they planned to spend the night. Mountain Justice moved slowly, but it moved with absolute certainty. At 11:15, Carson's team finished their work. They'd confiscated over $3,000 worth of equipment, enough moonshine to fill 2 evidence barrels, and detailed photographs of the entire operation. Carson stood beside his vehicle, satisfied with the job well done. In his mind, he'd struck a decisive blow against illegal alcohol production and sent a clear message that federal authority reached even into these remote mountains. "Load up!" Carson called to his men. "We'll process this evidence back in Beckley and file federal charges by the end of the week." As the convoy prepared to leave, Carson noticed something that made his confidence waver slightly. The forest around the compound had fallen completely silent. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, no normal sounds of mountain wildlife. Even the wind had died to an unnatural stillness. Agent Williams climbed into the passenger seat beside Carson, glancing uneasily at the tree line. "You notice how quiet it got?" Carson nodded, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. "These mountain people spook easy. Probably just hiding until we're gone." But Carson was wrong. The silence wasn't fear, it was preparation. The mountain was getting ready for war, and Samuel Hatfield was about to teach 11 federal agents that some traditions were worth more than government badges and federal authority. As the convoy wound down Copperhead Ridge, Carson felt a strange sensation between his shoulder blades, as if someone was watching him through rifle sights. He dismissed the feeling as mountain paranoia, but his instincts were more accurate than he realized. From 5 different positions along the ridge, 5 pairs of eyes tracked his movement with the patient focus of people who'd been taught that revenge, like good whiskey, was best served after a proper aging. The convoy disappeared around a bend in the mountain road at 11:33 that morning. It would be the last time anyone saw the 11 revenue men alive. But their real mistake hadn't been confiscating Samuel Hatfield's still. Their real mistake had been assuming that federal authority meant something to people who'd been fighting government control since before there was a government to control them. The Mountain Code was about to be enforced, and Samuel Hatfield was about to remind Washington, D.C. that some parts of America had never truly been conquered. Ruth Ellen Hatfield had inherited more than just her grandmother's intuition. She'd inherited 40 years of accumulated knowledge about how federal agents operated, how they thought, and most importantly, how they could be tracked. As she watched Carson's convoy disappear into the forest, she was already calculating distances, timing, and the 17 different routes they could take to reach the main highway. The family regrouped at what locals called the Council Rock, a granite outcrop half a mile from the compound where the Hatfields had made important decisions for 3 generations. Samuel arrived first, his face carved with the kind of controlled anger that comes from watching strangers destroy something your grandfather built with his own hands. Marcus climbed up from the south approach, his rifle slung across his shoulder and mud on his boots from tracking the convoy's initial departure. "They're headed toward Hollow Creek Road," he reported, taking it slow, probably figuring we're too scared to follow. Jesse appeared from the north, carrying a canvas bag filled with items most people wouldn't consider weapons, but which could be deadly in the right hands. "Tommy Briggs was with them," Jesse said, his voice carrying the particular disgust mountain people reserved for informants. "Saw him pointing out where we kept the overflow barrels. Young Tom was the last to arrive, breathing hard from running uphill. At 19, he possessed the kind of reckless courage that worried his father and impressed his brothers." "They're moving toward the old Lumber Road junction," Tom reported. "If they keep that heading, they'll have to stop in Beckley for the night. That's 60 miles of mountain road ahead of them." Samuel studied his children with the measured gaze of a man who'd spent his entire life preparing for this moment. The government had finally crossed the line that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd taken more than equipment and whiskey. They'd taken dignity, tradition, and the fundamental right to live free from federal interference. "Ruth Ellen," Samuel said quietly, "you said this morning we needed to shut down the run. How long did you figure we had?" Ruth Ellen closed her eyes, reaching back into the well of mountain wisdom that had guided her family for generations. "I saw federal vehicles in my dreams for 3 nights running. Always the same dream. Black cars winding up the ridge, men with badges, and something ending that couldn't be started again." Samuel nodded slowly. The women in his family had possessed the site for as long as anyone could remember. His grandmother had predicted the stock market crash of 1929. His mother had known his father would die in the mine collapse of 1952. And Ruth Ellen had never been wrong about trouble coming to the mountain. "Then they knew we were here before they started climbing," Samuel concluded. "This wasn't some lucky guess or random raid. Somebody gave them everything: location, layout, timing. Somebody we trusted." The implications hung in the mountain air like smoke from a dying fire. Betrayal was the one sin the Mountain Code never forgave. Whoever had sold them out hadn't just violated trust. They'd violated something sacred, something that held mountain communities together against outside pressure. Marcus checked his rifle, a lever-action Winchester that had belonged to his great-grandfather. "What's the plan, Papa?" Samuel stood silent for a long moment, looking down into the hollow where his family had made their living for 56 years. The compound was destroyed, but the family was intact. The government had won a battle, but the war was just beginning. "The plan," Samuel said slowly, "is to teach Washington, D.C. that some things cost more than they're worth. Carson and his boys think they're going home heroes. They think they've broken the Hatfield family. They think federal authority trumps mountain justice." Samuel's voice carried the weight of generations of accumulated grievances against federal interference. Every tax collector, every government agent, every federal regulation that had tried to change the way mountain people lived had contributed to this moment. "They took our still," Samuel continued. "They took our whiskey. They took our livelihood. But most importantly, they took something that didn't belong to them. They took our respect. And respect once stolen can only be repaid with interest." Ruth Ellen understood first. "You're talking about the old justice." Samuel nodded. "I'm talking about the Mountain Code. The code that says when a man violates your family, your home, and your heritage, you don't call the law. You become the law." Jesse shifted uncomfortably. At 25, he'd heard stories about the old justice, but he'd never seen it enforced. "Papa, we're talking about federal agents. This isn't some local dispute over property lines." "No," Samuel agreed. It's bigger than that. It's about whether the federal government can walk into these mountains and destroy families that have been here since before there was a federal government to worry about. Tom stepped forward, young enough to be excited rather than worried. What do you need us to do? Samuel looked at each of his children in turn, measuring their resolve, their understanding, and their commitment to something larger than individual survival. First, we track them. Find out where they're stopping, how they're traveling, what kind of security they're maintaining. Federal agents think different than mountain people. They follow procedures, they trust equipment, and they believe in the power of their badges. Marcus grinned, understanding his father's strategy, and that makes them predictable. Exactly, Samuel confirmed. They'll follow the main road because they don't know the mountain trails. They'll stop at the federal building in Beckley because that's where their procedures tell them to go. They'll process evidence according to federal guidelines because they believe in federal procedures. Ruth Ellen was already thinking ahead, but they don't know we're following. They don't know anything about us, Samuel said. Carson's file probably lists me as some ignorant hillbilly who makes the moonshine because he's too stupid to get a real job. They have no idea that this family has been fighting government interference for 3 generations. Samuel's grandfather had resisted federal tax collectors during Prohibition. His father had hidden from government agents during the mine unionization conflicts of the 1940s. Samuel himself had perfected the art of avoiding federal detection while building one of the most sophisticated moonshine operations in Appalachian history. The government thinks it won today, Samuel continued. Let them think that. Let them process their evidence, file their reports, and congratulate themselves on a successful raid. Let them believe they're safe in their federal building with their federal procedures. The plan was beginning to take shape in Samuel's mind, built on 40 years of studying how government agents operated and where their confidence became complacency. Federal agents were trained to handle criminals who fought back immediately, violently, and stupidly. They weren't prepared for mountain people who fought back slowly, methodically, and with intimate knowledge of terrain that had swallowed government agents before. Tonight we start tracking, Samuel announced. Ruth Ellen, you take the high trail and maintain visual contact with their convoy. Marcus and Jesse, you follow using the logging roads and establish their stopping point. Tom, you stay with me. We're going to visit some old friends who owe us favors. Ruth Ellen checked her equipment. Binoculars, compass, emergency food, and the kind of practical gear mountain people carried when they planned to spend time in wilderness that could kill the unprepared. How long do we follow them? Samuel's answer carried the weight of a man who'd made peace with consequences that couldn't be undone. Until they understand that some actions have prices that can't be paid with federal authority. The family separated at the Council Rock, each moving toward predetermined positions with the coordination of people who'd practiced emergency procedures their entire lives. Samuel and Tom headed toward the old mining camp where Samuel's cousin lived, a man who'd served in Vietnam and possessed both the skills and the inclination to help family members settle scores with federal agents. As the afternoon sun filtered through the autumn leaves, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced since his father's death. The weight of generational responsibility. The decisions he made over the next few days would determine whether the Hatfield family survived as an independent mountain clan or disappeared into the federal prison system like so many other families who'd challenged government authority. But Samuel also felt something else, something that had sustained mountain people through poverty, government oppression, and cultural destruction for over 2 centuries. He felt the absolute certainty that some traditions were worth more than personal safety, and that some principles were worth dying for. The Mountain Code was about to be enforced, and Carson's 11 federal agents were about to discover that in these hills, federal authority meant nothing compared to family honor and the ancient law that governed how mountain people settled their debts. Federal agent William Carson felt the satisfaction of a job well done as his convoy wound through the narrow mountain roads toward Beckley. The confiscated moonshine equipment filled 2 government trailers, representing what would likely be the biggest bust of his career. In the passenger seat beside him, Agent Perry Williams was already drafting the incident report that would earn commendations from their supervisors in Washington. "Clean operation," Williams remarked, checking his watch. "In and out in 3 hours, no resistance, complete confiscation of illegal equipment. The prosecutor's going to love this case." Carson nodded, but something nagged at him as he watched the dense forest roll past his window. In 12 years of federal enforcement, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts were telling him something wasn't right about the morning's raid. The Hatfield compound had been too neat, too prepared, too perfectly shut down for people who supposedly had no warning of federal interest. Behind them, the convoy stretched in a disciplined line. 2 evidence trailers, a communications vehicle, and 2 additional cars carrying the remaining 8 agents. Standard federal procedure called for maintaining radio contact, predetermined intervals between vehicles, and constant awareness of potential threats. Carson's team followed every protocol exactly as they'd been trained. What they didn't know was that Ruth Ellen Hatfield was tracking their movement from ridgelines they couldn't see, using trails they didn't know existed. At 26, Ruth Ellen possessed what 3 generations of mountain living had taught her family: the ability to move through forest terrain like smoke through trees. She maintained visual contact with the convoy while staying completely invisible, a skill that would have impressed military scouts but was simply normal life for someone raised in these mountains. Ruth Ellen carried minimal equipment: her grandfather's military binoculars, a compass that had guided her family through these mountains for 40 years, emergency rations that could sustain her for 3 days, and a small notebook where she recorded the convoy's speed, stopping patterns, and security procedures. Every detail would be crucial for what her father was planning. From her position on Hawks Ridge, Ruth Ellen could see the entire route Carson's convoy would take to reach the main highway. The mountain road twisted through 17 switchbacks, crossed 3 creek beds, and passed through 2 areas where the forest canopy created perfect concealment for anyone who wanted to observe federal vehicles without being detected. Ruth Ellen keyed her 2-way radio once. A brief burst of static that told her brother she had visual contact and the convoy was proceeding as expected. Marcus and Jesse were positioned at different points along the route, ready to take over surveillance when the federal vehicles passed beyond her sightlines. At 12:47 p.m., Carson's convoy reached the first significant checkpoint, the intersection where Hollow Creek Road merged with County Highway 16. Carson ordered a brief stop to check his maps and confirm their route to Beckley. This was standard procedure. Federal agents were trained to verify their position regularly when traveling through unfamiliar terrain. Agent Williams stepped out of the lead vehicle to stretch his legs and survey their surroundings. The October air carried the crisp bite of approaching winter, and the forest around them blazed with autumn colors that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But something about the silence bothered Williams. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, no normal sounds of mountain wildlife. "You notice how quiet it is?" Williams asked Carson. Carson had noticed, but he attributed it to the natural wariness of mountain wildlife around motor vehicles. "These backwoods animals aren't used to federal convoys, he replied. "They'll come back once we're gone." What neither agent realized was that the silence wasn't caused by their presence. It was caused by the presence of Marcus Hatfield, who was positioned less than 200 yards away, hidden in a natural blind that his grandfather had used to watch for government agents during the Great Depression. Wildlife had learned to avoid areas where the Hatfield family was conducting business. Marcus studied the federal agents through his rifle scope, not with any intention of shooting, but to gather intelligence about their equipment, their procedures, and their individual characteristics. He noted that Carson was clearly the leader. Other agents deferred to him, waited for his decisions, and looked at him for guidance. Williams appeared to be second in command, responsible for communications and coordination. Marcus also observed that the federal agents moved with the confidence of people who believed their authority was absolute. They didn't scan the tree line for threats, didn't position sentries while stopped, and didn't take any precautions that suggested they felt vulnerable. Their entire demeanor suggested they viewed this operation as routine law enforcement rather than potential combat. Through his radio, Marcus whispered a brief report to his father. 11 agents, standard government vehicles, following Highway 16 toward Beckley. No special security measures. Estimated arrival at Federal Building between 3:30 and 4:00 p.m. Samuel Hatfield received this intelligence while sitting in the kitchen of his cousin's mountain cabin, studying topographical maps that showed every road, trail, and creek bed between Copperhead Ridge and the Federal Building in Beckley. Beside him sat Dale Morrison, a wiry man in his 50s who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam and had spent the last 20 years helping mountain families solve problems that couldn't be handled through legal channels. Dale Morrison wasn't technically a member of the Hatfield clan, but he'd married Samuel's second cousin and had earned the respect of mountain families through 15 years of discreet, effective problem solving. When government agents harassed local families, when federal regulations threatened mountain livelihoods, when outside pressure threatened traditional ways of life, Dale Morrison was the man families called. 11 agents, Dale repeated, studying the maps. That's a lot of firepower for a moonshine bust. Samuel nodded grimly. They didn't come here just to confiscate equipment. They came here to send a message. Federal authority reaches everywhere mountain families can't protect themselves. Resistance is futile. Dale traced potential routes on the topographical maps with a finger scarred from 20 years of machine work. If they're following standard procedures, they'll process the evidence at the federal building tonight, file initial reports, and probably stay overnight at the federal hotel. Government agents don't like sleeping in local establishments when they're working mountain cases. How long before they transport everything back to Washington? Samuel asked. Probably 3 to 5 days. Dale replied, they'll want to interview local contacts, file supplementary reports, maybe conduct follow-up raids if they think you had distribution networks. Samuel felt a cold anger settling in his chest. The federal government wasn't just destroying his family's livelihood. They were preparing to destroy the entire network of mountain families who'd trusted the Hatfields for generations. Every customer, every contact, every person who'd ever bought Hatfield whiskey was now potentially subject to federal investigation. They're not just coming after us, Samuel realized. They're coming after everyone. Dale nodded. That's how federal enforcement works in mountain areas. They use one bust to justify investigating entire communities. Before they're finished, they'll have federal files on half the families in 3 counties. This changed everything for Samuel. What had started as a personal violation, the destruction of his family's moonshine operation, was now a threat to the entire mountain community that had sustained his family for generations. The federal government was preparing to use the Hatfield bust as a foundation for dismantling traditional mountain culture itself. Samuel's radio crackled with Jesse's voice. Convoy passing Miller's Bend, still following Highway 16, no changes in speed or security. Samuel keyed his radio in response. Continue surveillance, report any changes immediately. Dale Morrison studied Samuel's face with the careful attention of someone who'd seen mountain men make decisions that couldn't be unmade. You're thinking about the old justice. Samuel nodded slowly. I'm thinking about survival. Not just family survival, community survival, if we let this stand. If we let Carson and his boys return to Washington with their evidence and their reports and their recommendations for expanded federal enforcement, they'll be back here within 6 months with 50 agents instead of 11. And if you don't let it stand? Samuel's answer carried the weight of 40 years of accumulated resistance to federal interference. Then we send a different message. We remind Washington, D.C. that some parts of America still believe in local justice and traditional authority. At 2:15 p.m., Carson's convoy reached the outskirts of Beckley, a small city that served as the regional headquarters for federal enforcement in southern West Virginia. The federal building sat on Main Street like a concrete monument to government authority, surrounded by local businesses that had learned to coexist with federal employees who enforced laws that mountain people had never accepted. Carson felt relief as the federal building came into view. The mountain portion of their operation was complete, and the administrative portion could be handled according to standard federal procedures. Evidence would be processed, reports would be filed, and arrest warrants would be issued within 72 hours. Agent Williams began coordinating the unloading of evidence with federal technicians who specialized in processing moonshine equipment. The copper still would be photographed from every angle, tested for fingerprints, and analyzed for manufacturing techniques that might provide clues about distribution networks. Beautiful work, one technician commented as he examined the still. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't some amateur operation. This is 3 generations of accumulated expertise. Carson nodded, feeling satisfied that his bust had netted such high-quality evidence. The Hatfield operation represented exactly the kind of sophisticated illegal activity that federal enforcement was designed to eliminate. In his mind, he'd struck a decisive blow against organized resistance to federal authority. What Carson didn't know was that Tom Hatfield was watching the evidence transfer from a parking garage across the street, using binoculars to identify every federal employee involved in processing his family's equipment. Tom was the youngest Hatfield, but he'd inherited his family's patience and his grandfather's understanding that intelligence gathering was the foundation of effective resistance. Tom noted the number of federal employees, their shift changes, their security procedures, and the location of every entrance and exit to the federal building. He also noted something that would prove crucial to his father's planning. The federal agents were clearly exhausted from their mountain operation and were looking forward to a comfortable night in government-provided accommodations. At 3:47 p.m., Tom keyed his radio. Evidence transfer complete. All federal personnel inside the building. No special security measures observed. Samuel received this report while driving toward Beckley with Dale Morrison, following back roads that wouldn't bring them anywhere near federal surveillance. Samuel's plan was taking shape, built on 30 years of studying how federal agents operated and where their procedures created vulnerability. Federal agents think in terms of procedure and authority, Samuel explained to Dale as they drove. They follow rules, they trust equipment, and they believe in the power of their badges. But procedures can be predicted, equipment can be defeated, and badges don't stop bullets. Dale Morrison had spent enough time in Vietnam to understand the difference between conventional warfare and the kind of conflict Samuel was contemplating. You're talking about guerrilla tactics. I'm talking about mountain justice, Samuel corrected. The same justice that protected mountain families during the Civil War, during Prohibition, during the Mine Wars, and during every federal intrusion that threatened traditional ways of life. As evening approached, Carson's 11 agents settled into their government accommodations, confident that their successful raid had sent a clear message about federal authority in mountain areas. They had no idea that they were being watched, studied, and systematically prepared for a lesson in mountain justice that would redefine federal enforcement policy for the next 20 years. The hunt was about to begin, and Carson's federal agents were about to discover that in these mountains, traditional authority still trumped federal procedure. Family honor still mattered more than government rules, and some violations of mountain code carried penalties that couldn't be appealed to any federal court. The federal building in Beckley stood like a fortress of government authority, its concrete walls and bulletproof windows designed to intimidate anyone who might question federal power. Inside, Agent Carson and his team worked late into the evening, processing evidence and filing reports that would destroy the Hatfield family's livelihood forever. Outside, in the gathering darkness of an October night, Samuel Hatfield was preparing to remind the federal government that some traditions were older than its authority. Samuel sat in Dale Morrison's pickup truck in a parking lot 6 blocks from the federal building, studying architectural plans that Dale had somehow acquired through connections that survived from his military service. The federal building had been constructed in 1967 according to standard government specifications: reinforced concrete, limited access points, internal security systems, and emergency procedures designed to handle civil unrest or terrorist attacks. 12 federal agents working the night shift, Dale reported, studying surveillance notes that Tom Hatfield had gathered throughout the afternoon. 6 processing evidence in the basement laboratory, 3 maintaining communications on the second floor, 2 providing building security, and 1 supervising the overnight operation. Samuel nodded, his weathered face illuminated by the dim glow of a flashlight as he studied building diagrams. At 53, he possessed the patience of someone who'd spent his entire life waiting for the right moment to strike back against federal intrusion. Tonight wasn't about immediate gratification. It was about sending a message that would echo through federal enforcement agencies for decades. "What about Carson's team?" Samuel asked. "Checked into the Federal Inn at 7:30 p.m., Dale replied. "Standard government accommodations 2 miles from the building. They're planning to complete their paperwork tomorrow morning and drive back to Washington on Friday afternoon." Samuel felt the cold satisfaction of a plan coming together. Federal agents operated according to predictable patterns, followed standard procedures, and trusted in the security provided by government facilities. They had no experience dealing with mountain people who'd been resisting government authority since before the Civil War. Ruth Ellen's voice crackled over the radio from her surveillance position near the Federal Inn. All 11 agents accounted for. Vehicles secured in the hotel parking garage. No special security measures observed. Samuel keyed his radio in response. Maintain surveillance. Report any changes immediately. The plan Samuel had developed wasn't designed to kill federal agents. Mountain justice was more sophisticated than simple revenge. The plan was designed to teach the federal government that some costs were too high to bear, that some communities couldn't be intimidated by badges and authority, and that traditional mountain culture would defend itself through methods the government couldn't predict or prevent. Marcus and Jesse had spent the afternoon studying the route between the Federal Inn and the Federal Building, identifying 17 potential ambush points where mountain terrain provided perfect concealment for anyone who wanted to observe federal vehicles without being detected. They'd also identified 3 locations where the road passed through narrow valleys that could be blocked without federal agents having any means of escape or communication. The beauty of mountain warfare, Samuel explained to Dale as they drove toward their rendezvous point with his sons, is that terrain always favors local knowledge over federal procedure. These agents might have training, equipment, and authority, but they don't have 40 years of experience moving through mountains that can swallow people who don't understand the rules. Dale Morrison had seen enough combat to understand the strategic advantage Samuel was describing. What's the endgame here? You can't fight the entire federal government. Samuel's answer carried the weight of generations of mountain philosophy. We're not fighting the federal government. We're educating them. We're teaching them that some communities cost more to control than they're worth, that some families have traditions worth defending, and that federal authority has limitations they need to understand. At 10:30 p.m., the Hatfield family gathered at the old mining camp, where Samuel's grandfather had hidden from government agents during the Prohibition era. The camp sat in a natural bowl between 2 ridges, invisible from any road and accessible only through trails that had been used by mountain families for over a century. Marcus arrived first, carrying detailed reconnaissance information about federal security procedures at the Federal Inn. 12-hour shift rotation, he reported. 2 security guards, standard hotel layout, government vehicles in a secured parking garage. The agents are tired, confident, and completely unprepared for any kind of resistance. Jesse emerged from the forest, carrying equipment that most people wouldn't consider dangerous, but which could be devastating in the hands of someone who understood mountain warfare. Climbing rope, hunting knives, emergency flares, and a collection of tools that mountain people used for everything from mining to construction. Tom appeared last, his young face flushed with excitement and nervous energy. At 19, he possessed the reckless courage that worried his father, but which might prove essential for the kind of operation Samuel was planning. Ruth Ellen established communication protocols with a radio system that connected all family members while remaining invisible to federal monitoring equipment. Mountain families had learned during the mine wars that government agents could intercept conventional communications, but they had no experience with the kind of informal networks that sustained mountain communities. The federal agents think they're safe, Ruth Ellen reported. They've followed standard procedures, they're staying in a government facility, and they believe their federal authority protects them from local retaliation. Samuel nodded, feeling the satisfaction of an experienced hunter who'd successfully studied his prey. Federal agents are trained to handle criminals who fight back immediately, violently, and predictably. They're not trained to handle mountain people who fight back slowly, systematically, and with intimate knowledge of terrain that's been killing government agents since the Civil War. The plan Samuel outlined to his family was complex, requiring perfect coordination and absolute commitment. It wasn't designed to provide immediate gratification. It was designed to create a situation where federal agents would understand that their authority had limitations, that mountain justice operated according to different rules, and that some violations of community standards carried penalties that couldn't be appealed to federal courts. Phase 1, Oblast, Samuel explained, is psychological pressure. We let them know they're being watched, studied, and evaluated according to standards they don't understand. We create the kind of stress that makes federal agents question their procedures, their authority, and their safety. Dale Morrison understood the strategy. Break their confidence before you break their resistance. Exactly, Samuel confirmed. Federal agents are trained to project authority, but that authority depends on people believing in federal power. Take away that belief, and you take away their most important weapon. Ruth Ellen would coordinate surveillance and communications, ensuring that every federal agent was tracked, every movement was monitored, and every procedure was analyzed for weaknesses that could be exploited. Her position would be mobile, shifting between observation posts that provided complete coverage of federal activities while remaining invisible to government monitoring. Marcus and Jesse would handle what Samuel called environmental modification, subtle changes to the federal agent's environment that would create confusion, uncertainty, and the growing awareness that they were operating in hostile territory controlled by people who understood the rules better than any federal manual could teach. Tom would serve as the family's mobile reconnaissance unit, gathering intelligence about federal procedures, security measures, and individual agent characteristics that might prove useful for psychological pressure. His youth and apparent innocence would allow him to operate in areas where adult mountain men might attract federal attention. Phase 2, Samuel continued, is isolation. We separate them from their vehicles, their communications, and their support systems. We create a situation where federal procedures become useless and federal authority becomes meaningless. Dale Morrison had participated in similar operations during his military service, and he understood the psychological impact Samuel was describing. You're talking about creating a controlled environment where they have to operate according to your rules instead of federal procedures. Mountain justice has always operated that way, Samuel replied. When government agents violate mountain traditions, the mountain decides how justice gets administered. Federal courts don't have jurisdiction over mountain code violations. The family spent 2 hours reviewing every detail of the operation, identifying potential problems, establishing contingency plans, and ensuring that everyone understood their role in an enterprise that would either restore mountain dignity or destroy the Hatfield family forever. At 12:47 a.m., Samuel called for a moment of silence, a tradition his grandfather had established before dangerous operations during the mine wars. The silence wasn't prayer exactly, but acknowledgement that some actions created consequences that couldn't be predicted or controlled. 40 years ago, Samuel said quietly, the federal government started thinking it could control every aspect of American life. They started thinking federal authority trumped local tradition, federal law superseded family honor, and federal agents could violate mountain communities without paying any price. Samuel's voice carried the accumulated grievances of 3 generations of mountain families who'd watched federal power expand into every corner of traditional life. Tonight, we remind them that America still has places where local justice matters more than federal authority, where family traditions are worth defending, and where government agents answer to the communities they claim to serve. Ruth Ellen checked her radio equipment, Marcus and Jesse gathered their tools, Tom secured his surveillance gear, and Dale Morrison started his vehicle. The operation would begin before dawn, when federal agents were most vulnerable and mountain people possessed their greatest advantage. One more thing, Samuel added as his family prepared to leave the mining camp. This isn't about revenge, this is about education. We're teaching the federal government a lesson they need to learn, and we're doing it in a way that mountain people have used to protect their families for over 2 centuries. As the family dispersed into the October darkness, Samuel felt the weight of generational responsibility settling on his shoulders. The decisions he made over the next 12 hours would determine whether mountain communities could still defend themselves against federal intrusion, whether traditional justice could still compete with government authority, and whether the Hatfield name would be remembered for resistance or destruction. The federal agents slept peacefully in their government accommodations, confident that their successful raid had demonstrated federal power to mountain communities that needed to understand government authority. They had no idea that they were about to receive an education in mountain warfare that would redefine federal enforcement policy throughout Appalachian America. The mountain was about to collect a debt that had been accumulating interest for 40 years, and Carson's 11 federal agents were about to discover that some communities still believed in justice that operated outside federal jurisdiction, answered to traditions older than government authority, and enforced community standards through methods the government couldn't predict, prevent, or prosecute. The October morning arrived cold and clear, with frost coating the mountain ridges like crystallized silence. Federal Agent William Carson woke at 5:30 a.m. in his government-issued hotel room, feeling the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. His team had successfully dismantled what appeared to be one of the most sophisticated moonshine operations in Appalachian history, and today they would complete their paperwork and return to Washington as heroes of federal law enforcement. Carson had no way of knowing that Samuel Hatfield had been awake since 3:00 a.m., positioned on a ridge overlooking the Federal Inn, watching every light that appeared in every window. Samuel possessed the patience of someone who'd spent 40 years studying how government agents operated, and he understood that federal procedures created predictable vulnerabilities that mountain people could exploit with devastating effectiveness. At 6:15 a.m., Carson's team gathered in the hotel restaurant for what they assumed would be a routine breakfast before completing their federal business. The 11 agents discussed their successful raid with the confident satisfaction of people who believed their authority was absolute and their safety was guaranteed by federal protection. Agent Perry Williams spread topographical maps across the restaurant table, pointing out the routes they'd use to access the Hatfield compound. "Clean operation from start to finish," Williams observed. "These mountain families fold fast when they see real federal authority." Carson nodded, but something continued to nag at him. The Hatfield compound had been too perfectly prepared for federal inspection, too completely shut down, too systematically concealed. In 12 years of federal enforcement, Carson had learned to distinguish between criminal operations that were surprised by raids and operations that had advance warning of federal interest. "You think they knew we were coming?" Williams asked, reading the concern on Carson's face. Carson stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "Maybe, but it doesn't matter now. We've got their equipment, we've got evidence of federal violations, and we've got enough information to file charges that will put the whole family in federal prison." What Carson didn't realize was that Ruth Ellen Hatfield was monitoring their conversation from a booth in the restaurant's back corner, disguised as a local woman having morning coffee before work. At 26, Ruth Ellen possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that allowed her to blend into any environment while gathering intelligence that would prove crucial for her family's operation. Ruth Ellen keyed her radio discreetly. "Federal team preparing to leave hotel at 7:00 a.m. Standard convoy formation, same route as yesterday. No changes in security procedures." Samuel received this intelligence while positioned at what mountain people called the Narrows, a section of mountain road where the forest closed so tightly around the asphalt that federal vehicles would have to pass single file through a corridor barely wider than their cars. Samuel's grandfather had used this location to ambush government agents during the mine wars, and Samuel understood that terrain advantages could neutralize federal authority more effectively than any weapon. Marcus and Jesse had spent the pre-dawn hours preparing the Narrows according to techniques their grandfather had learned during 40 years of resisting government intrusion. They hadn't damaged the road or created obvious obstacles. Instead, they'd modified the environment in ways that would create confusion, delay, and the growing awareness that federal agents were operating in territory controlled by people who understood mountain warfare better than any government manual could teach. At 7:03 a.m., Carson's convoy left the Federal Inn, following the same route they'd used the previous day. Standard federal procedure called for maintaining radio contact, predetermined intervals between vehicles, and constant awareness of potential threats. Carson's team followed every protocol exactly as they'd been trained, confident that federal procedures provided adequate security for government operations in mountain areas. The convoy consisted of 11 agents in 4 vehicles. Carson and Williams in the lead car, 2 agents in each of the next 2 vehicles, and 5 agents in the trailing vehicle that also contained communication equipment and emergency supplies. Federal doctrine emphasized maintaining convoy integrity, avoiding predictable stops, and reaching secure federal facilities as quickly as possible. What the federal agents didn't know was that the Hatfield family had transformed the mountain road into a carefully orchestrated trap that would demonstrate the difference between federal authority and mountain justice. Every curve, every straightaway, every potential stopping point had been studied, prepared, and converted into an element of psychological pressure that would slowly strip away federal confidence until Carson's agents understood that they were operating according to rules they'd never learned. At 7:19 a.m., the federal convoy reached the first modification point, a section of road where Jesse Hatfield had used hunting techniques to create what appeared to be natural obstacles. A fallen tree branch blocked half the roadway, forcing the convoy to slow and navigate carefully around the obstruction. The delay lasted only 90 seconds, but It established a pattern that would become increasingly obvious to federal agents who were trained to recognize tactical situations. Carson felt his first moment of unease as he maneuvered around the branch. "That tree wasn't down yesterday," he muttered to Williams. Williams checked his maps and radio protocols. "Probably fell during the night. These mountain roads aren't maintained like federal highways." But Carson's instincts told him something different. The branch was positioned too perfectly to be accidental, placed exactly where it would force federal vehicles to slow without creating sufficient obstruction to justify calling for road maintenance. Someone with intimate knowledge of traffic patterns had positioned that obstacle deliberately. The second modification appeared at 7:27 a.m., a section of road where Marcus Hatfield had used mining techniques to create what looked like natural erosion, but which actually forced the convoy to reduce speed and navigate single file through a narrow passage. Again, the delay was minimal, less than 2 minutes, but the psychological impact was cumulative. "Two obstacles in 10 minutes, Carson observed to Williams. That's not coincidence. Williams was beginning to share Carson's concern. "You think the Hatfields are trying to slow us down?" Carson didn't answer immediately because he was beginning to understand that the Hatfield family possessed capabilities he hadn't considered. The obstacles weren't designed to stop the federal convoy. They were designed to demonstrate that someone was controlling the federal agents' movement, timing their progress and creating conditions that favored mountain people over government authority. At 7:34 a.m., Ruth Ellen's voice crackled over Samuel's radio. "Federal convoy entering the Narrows. All vehicles proceeding according to plan. Agents appear increasingly concerned about road conditions." Samuel smiled grimly from his position overlooking the Narrows. Federal agents were trained to recognize obvious threats: armed resistance, roadblocks, direct confrontation. But they had no experience dealing with mountain people who used terrain, timing, and psychological pressure to create tactical advantages that couldn't be countered through federal procedures. The Narrows represented the culmination of 3 generations of accumulated knowledge about mountain warfare. Samuel's grandfather had used this location to demonstrate that government agents were vulnerable when they operated outside urban environments, where federal authority was absolute. Samuel was about to provide the same lesson to a new generation of federal agents who needed to understand the limitations of their power. Carson's convoy entered the Narrows at 7:36 a.m., immediately experiencing the claustrophobic sensation of driving through a tunnel created by forest canopy so dense that sunlight barely penetrated to road level. The lead vehicle's radio began experiencing interference. Not equipment failure, but natural electromagnetic disruption created by iron deposits in the surrounding rock formations. "Communications are degrading," Williams reported, adjusting radio frequencies that had worked perfectly on open road. "Signal strength is dropping significantly." Carson felt his unease intensifying. Federal agents depended on communication with headquarters, with support teams, and with emergency services that could provide backup if situations developed beyond their control. In the Narrows, that communication was being systematically eliminated by natural conditions that mountain people understood, but federal training had never addressed. The psychological pressure intensified when Carson realized that his convoy was completely committed to the narrow passage with no possibility of turning around, backing up, or deviating from a route that someone else was obviously controlling. Federal doctrine emphasized maintaining tactical flexibility, but the Narrows eliminated every option except continuing forward according to whatever plan the Hatfield family had prepared. At 7:41 a.m., the trap closed. Tom Hatfield appeared in the road ahead of the convoy, not threatening, not armed, simply standing in the center of the asphalt with his hands visible and his posture indicating he wanted to communicate with the federal agents. Carson had 2 choices: stop the convoy and find out what the young mountain man wanted, or run down an unarmed citizen who was exercising his constitutional right to free speech. Carson chose to stop. "Stay in the vehicles," Carson ordered over the radio. "Keep engines running and be prepared to move immediately if this situation develops." Tom Hatfield approached the lead vehicle with the unhurried confidence of someone who understood that federal agents were now operating according to mountain rules rather than government procedures. At 19, Tom possessed the kind of fearless certainty that comes from absolute faith in family traditions and complete knowledge of tactical advantages that federal training couldn't provide. Carson lowered his window slightly. "You need to move away from this road immediately. This is a federal convoy conducting official government business." Tom nodded respectfully. Yes, sir, I understand that. My family sent me to deliver a message about federal business that concerns our community. Carson felt his throat tighten. What message? Tom's answer was delivered in the polite, measured tone that mountain people used when explaining fundamental facts to people who didn't understand local customs. The message is that federal agents who violate mountain families need to understand the consequences of their actions before those consequences become irreversible. Behind Tom, the forest began to move. Not obviously, not dramatically, but with the subtle shifts that indicated human presence to anyone trained to recognize tactical positioning. Carson's peripheral vision caught glimpses of movement that suggested the federal convoy was being observed from multiple concealed positions by people who possessed intimate knowledge of this terrain. Williams keyed the radio. All units maintain alert status. We may have multiple contacts in concealed positions. Tom heard the radio transmission and smiled with the patient amusement of someone explaining obvious facts to confused children. Yes, sir, my family is positioned throughout these mountains. We've been watching federal agents since you left the hotel this morning, and we've been preparing to have a conversation about mountain justice. Carson's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, but Tom shook his head gently. That wouldn't be wise, sir. Federal weapons are designed for urban situations where government authority is absolute. These mountains operate according to different rules, and my family has been preparing for this conversation for 3 generations. From the surrounding forest, Samuel Hatfield's voice carried clearly to every federal agent. Agent Carson, your convoy is surrounded by people who know these mountains better than you know federal procedures. Your communications are compromised, your tactical position is untenable, and your federal authority means nothing in territory controlled by families who've been resisting government intrusion since before your agency existed. Carson felt the weight of tactical reality settling on his shoulders. His convoy was trapped in a narrow passage with no escape routes, surrounded by hostile forces operating in terrain. They controlled completely and facing a situation that no federal training had prepared him to handle. What do you want? Carson called toward the forest, where Samuel's voice had originated. Samuel's answer carried the authority of 3 generations of mountain justice. We want federal agents to understand that some communities have traditions worth defending, that some families possess knowledge more valuable than government authority, and that some violations of mountain code carry penalties that can't be appealed to federal courts. Williams tried to reestablish radio contact with federal headquarters, but the surrounding mountains created an electromagnetic dead zone that made communication impossible. The federal agents were completely isolated, dependent on their own resources and facing opponents who possessed every tactical advantage that terrain, local knowledge, and generational preparation could provide. Phase 1 is complete, Samuel announced from his concealed position. Federal agents now understand that their authority has limitations, their procedures have weaknesses, and their safety depends on respecting traditions they tried to destroy. Tom stepped closer to Carson's vehicle. Phase 2 involves educating federal agents about the difference between government law and mountain justice. Your agency confiscated equipment that represented 3 generations of family tradition. You violated property rights that predate federal authority. You threatened the livelihood of people who never accepted government control over traditional activities. Carson's chest tightened as he began to understand the scope of what the Hatfield family had prepared. This wasn't random resistance or spontaneous retaliation. This was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of mountain power designed to teach federal agents lessons they couldn't learn in any government training facility. Samuel emerged from the forest, not armed, not threatening, but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who controlled every aspect of the current situation. Behind him, Marcus and Jesse appeared from different positions, followed by Ruth Ellen and finally by Dale Morrison, whose military bearings suggested capabilities that extended far beyond what federal agents were prepared to handle. Agent Carson, Samuel said calmly, your federal raid yesterday destroyed something that took my family 56 years to build. You confiscated equipment that represented traditional knowledge passed down through 3 generations. You violated community standards that have governed mountain life since before the federal government had authority to regulate anything. Carson forced himself to maintain eye contact with Samuel, though every instinct told him he was facing someone who possessed advantages that federal authority couldn't neutralize. We were conducting legal enforcement of federal law. Your family was violating tax regulations and alcohol production statutes. Samuel nodded with a patient understanding of someone explaining fundamental truths to confused outsiders. Federal law assumes federal authority is absolute. Mountain law assumes community traditions supersede government regulations. Today, you discover which assumption is correct in these mountains. Ruth Ellen stepped forward, carrying equipment that federal agents recognized as communication gear, but which had been modified according to specifications that no government manual contained. Agent Carson, your headquarters expects regular communication updates. When those updates stop arriving, federal reinforcements will be dispatched to investigate your status. Carson felt a moment of hope that was immediately crushed by Ruth Ellen's next statement. Those reinforcements will face the same educational experience your team is receiving now. The mountain has been preparing for federal escalation for 3 generations. Dale Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood both military tactics and mountain warfare. Agent Carson, federal doctrine assumes that superior firepower and government authority can overcome local resistance. Mountain doctrine assumes that terrain, local knowledge, and generational preparation can neutralize federal advantages. Today's lesson involves discovering which doctrine is accurate. Williams tried once more to establish radio contact, but the electromagnetic interference was complete. The federal agents were operating in what military strategists called a communication void, isolated from support, dependent on their own resources, and facing opponents who controlled every aspect of their tactical environment. Samuel stepped closer to the federal convoy, his movement deliberate and unthreatening, but carrying implications that every federal agent understood. Agent Carson, your team has 2 choices. Choice 1 involves accepting that federal authority has limitations, acknowledging that mountain communities deserve respect, and agreeing to modify federal enforcement policies that violate traditional mountain life. Carson swallowed hard. What's choice 2? Samuel's answer was delivered with the calm certainty of someone stating inevitable facts. Choice 2 involves discovering how thoroughly mountain communities can defend themselves when federal agents refuse to acknowledge the limitations of government authority. The forest around the federal convoy had fallen into the kind of silence that indicated the presence of people who were prepared for violence but preferred education. Carson understood that he was facing a decision that would determine not just the immediate fate of his team, but the future relationship between federal enforcement and mountain communities throughout Appalachian America. Time for your decision, Agent Carson, Samuel said quietly. The mountain is patient, but mountain justice operates according to schedules that don't accommodate federal procedures. Carson looked at his 11 agents, trapped in vehicles that had become more liability than protection, surrounded by people who understood this terrain better than any federal manual could teach, and facing a situation that would either end in negotiation or tragedy. For the first time in 12 years of federal enforcement, Agent William Carson understood that government authority had found its limit in these ancient mountains, where family traditions were worth more than federal law, and where mountain justice still operated according to rules older than the Constitution itself. The mountain was ready to collect its debt, and Carson had to decide whether federal agents would learn about mountain justice through education or through experience that couldn't be survived.